The air in the Redemption First National Bank was thick with the scent of old paper-stale tobacco and the quiet desperation of a Saturday afternoon. Dust motes danced in the slanted columns of light, piercing the tall, grimy windows, each one a tiny world spinning in the oppressive silence. Elara Vance stood before the teller's cage, her shoulders set in a line as straight and unyielding as the horizon outside. The last of her savings, a meager pile of coins and worn bills, was being counted by a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in a state of mild disapproval. She focused on the rhythmic clink of the coins, a sound that marked the end of one life and the terrifying, empty beginning of another. Her fingers worried the edge of the silver locket tucked beneath her collar, its familiar coolness a small anchor in the churning sea of her uncertainty. Inside were two miniature portraits, faded ovals of tin that held the only faces of her parents she had ever known. It was all she had left of them, a silver shell containing the ghost of a memory. Suddenly, the lazy afternoon shattered. The bank's heavy oak doors flew open with a percussive slam that echoed like a gunshot. 5 figures stormed in their faces, obscured by dust-caked bandanas, their movements swift and violent. Panic erupted, a wave of shrieks and scrambling bodies. A woman screamed. A chair clattered to the floor. Elara froze, her blood turning to ice. The leader of the gang moved with an unnerving grace, a stark contrast to the brutish efficiency of his men. He was tall, dressed in a black duster that swirled around his boots, and even with his face covered, he commanded the room with an aura of cold, intelligent authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. It cut through the chaos like a razor. "Your cooperation is appreciated, but not required." His men were already at work, shoving petrified customers against the wall, their pistols held with practiced ease. One outlaw vaulted the teller's counter, his boots thudding on the wood, and began stuffing cash into a canvas sack. The lead teller, his face the color of old parchment, raised his hands in trembling surrender. Elara remained still, pressed against the counter, trying to make herself invisible. Her world had narrowed to the pounding of her own heart and the acrid smell of gun smoke that now tinged the air. But invisibility was a luxury she would not be afforded. The leader's eyes, a piercing pale blue over the edge of his bandana, swept the room and settled on her. He walked toward her, his spurs ringing a death knell on the floorboards. He ignored the cowering banker, the weeping clerk, everyone but her. He stopped just a foot away his height, casting her in a sudden, chilling shadow. "Well now," he murmured, his voice a low, predatory purr. "What have we here?" His gaze dropped from her face to her throat, where the fine silver chain of her locket was just visible. Before she could react, his gloved hand shot out, not to her purse, not to the money on the counter, but to the locket. He didn't unclasp it. He simply yanked. The delicate chain snapped, biting into her skin. She cried out a sharp gasp of pain and violation. He held the silver oval in his palm, his thumb tracing its etched surface. He wasn't looking at it as a piece of jewelry, but as an artifact, something he had been seeking. A flicker of cold, personal recognition lit his eyes. "A Vance always pays their debts," he said, his voice soft, meant only for her. The words made no sense, but the malice behind them was unmistakable. He wasn't just a robber. He was a specter from a past she didn't know she had. He pocketed the locket, the small weight of it, a profound and devastating theft. It was more than silver. He had stolen her parents, her history, the last tangible piece of her identity. "We're done here," he called to his men. The robbery was over as quickly as it had begun. The outlaws backed out their guns, still trained on the terrified occupants, and vanished into the sun-bleached street. For a long moment, the only sound was the ragged collective breath of those left behind. Then the dam of silence broke, and the room filled with sobs and frantic chatter. Ilara didn't hear them. She stood rooted to the spot, one hand pressed to the raw red line on her neck where the locket had been. The money on the counter was forgotten. Her destitution was a distant secondary problem. All that mattered was the hollow space in her chest and the chilling echo of the outlaw's words. He knew her name, and he had taken the only thing she had ever truly owned. In that dusty, violated bank, a new resolve hardened in her heart, sharp and cold as steel. She would find him. She would get her locket back. And she would discover why a man named Silas Kane had looked at her like a ghost he'd been hunting his entire life. Left with nothing but the clothes on her back and a firestorm of questions in her soul, Ilara Vance became a wraith in the town of redemption. The townsfolk treated her with a mixture of pity and suspicion, their whispers following her down the boardwalk like dry rustling leaves. She was the victim, the poor woman from the bank. But she was also a disruption, a reminder of the violence that lurked just beyond the edge of their civilized lives. The sheriff, a portly man named Gable, with a kind face and weary eyes, took her statement, but offered little hope. Silas Kane and his gang had vanished into the vast, unforgiving expanse of the territory, swallowed by the plains as if they had never been. Days bled into a week of gnawing hunger and sleepless nights spent in a corner of the livery stable, the smell of hay and horses a poor substitute for comfort. Her savings were gone, the locket was gone, and with them any semblance of a future. It was the bartender at the saloon, a cynical man named Gus, with a face like a crumpled map, who finally threw her a lifeline. Heard Jedediah Stone's looking for help. He grunted, wiping a glass with a stained rag. Out past the Crimson Canyons. Loner. Doesn't take to strangers. But he pays fair if you can stand the silence. The name was spoken with a measure of respect that was rare in Gus's vocabulary. The journey would be long and dangerous for a woman alone, but desperation was a powerful motivator. Jedediah Stone's ranch was not just a chance for work. It was a foothold, a place to anchor herself while she planned her hunt for Silas Kane. The trek took her 2 days on foot, following a winding, sun-scorched trail that led deeper into the wilderness. The sinking sun bled gold across the rugged plains, setting fire to the dust that danced in the evening breeze and casting long, lonely shadows from the skeletal ribs of distant mesas. The red sand glowed like embers under the unforgiving sun, and the wind whispered through the canyons, a mournful sound that seemed to speak of ages past. She arrived at the ranch gate as twilight painted the sky in bruises of purple and pink, her boots coated in dust, her body aching with exhaustion. The ranch was a solitary outpost against the vastness of the land, a patchwork of weathered corrals and a sturdy, unadorned cabin. A man stood leaning against a fence post, watching her approach. He was broad-shouldered and weathered, as the land itself, his face a testament to years spent under the sun and wind. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, measured her from beneath the brim of a sweat-stained hat. This had to be Jedediah Stone. She stopped at the gate, her pride the only thing holding her upright. "I'll sleep in the barn. Just give me work," she said, her voice steady but raspy from thirst and disuse. Jedediah Stone straightened up his movements, slow and deliberate. He walked to the gate, his gaze missing nothing, and the weariness in her posture, the defiant set of her jaw, the raw scrape on her neck. "Work's plenty," he said, his voice low and rumbling like gravel shifting in a dry riverbed. "But you look half-starved, and running from something fierce." She stiffened, pride flaring like a struck match. "I pull my weight." His eyes lingered on her, not unkindly, but with a pragmatism that saw past her defenses to the bone-deep hunger she tried to hide. He gave a slow, deliberate nod toward the large silvered barn that stood sentinel over the yard. It was a silent offer, an acceptance without promises. The barn was weathered, its wood a testament to decades of sun and storm. As Alara stepped inside, straw crunched under her boots. The air was cool and smelled of leather horses and dry earth, the scent of honest labor. She had slept in worse places, ditches, city alleys beneath rattling bridges. This felt almost like a luxury. Work meant survival, and she would claw for it with everything she had left. From the doorway, his silhouette long in the fading light, Jed watched her. "You don't gotta prove nothing to me," he said, his words a quiet challenge. "Just to yourself." She ignored him, her back turned as she dropped her meager pack. She was already rolling up her sleeves, her mind fixed on the dawn. The ranch was a refuge, yes, but more than that, it was a means to an end. Here she could gather her strength. Here she could learn the skills of this land. And from here she would begin her search for Silas Kane and the stolen piece of her soul. Morning broke sharp and cold, the sky, a clean, pale blue canvas. Alara was up before the first rooster crowed, the chill in the barn air, a bracing slap to her senses. She moved with a purpose born of desperation, mucking out stalls and hauling buckets of feed, the rhythmic work a balm to her restless mind. Her hands, soft from a life that had not demanded such labor, quickly blistered, but she didn't falter, wrapping them in strips of cloth torn from her spare shirt and carrying on. Jedediah worked alongside her, a silent, watchful presence. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime of such chores, his hands steady and sure as he roped a pair of skittish calves. He didn't offer praise or criticism, simply observed, his gaze as patient and assessing as the hawks that circled in the sky above. "You're stubborn," he remarked later that morning, tossing her a canteen. The water was cool and clean, a shock to her system. She drank deep, wiping her mouth with the back of her raw hand. "I'm alive," she shot back, her eyes daring him to argue. A ghost of a smile touched his lips before vanishing. "That you are." The days blurred into a grueling rhythm of sweat, dust, and muscle-deep exhaustion. Alara learned to mend fences under the searing sun, the wire biting into her fingers. She learned to herd cattle, her voice raw from shouting at the stubborn beasts. Slowly, painfully, she began to learn the pulse of the land itself, a language written in hoofprints, birdsong, and the subtle shift of the wind. Jed was a quiet teacher. He showed her how to read the signs of an approaching storm in the clouds that gathered over the distant mountains, how to distinguish the track of a coyote from that of a strayed dog. His voice was calm, a low counterpoint to the wildness of the landscape. But she sensed a fire in him, a coiled strength held carefully in reserve. It was in the way he handled a difficult horse with a firm but gentle hand, in the way his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon, always alert, always aware. She felt that intensity, a pull she couldn't name and didn't trust. At night, she returned to the barn, collapsing onto her bed of hay. Sleep was a restless, shallow affair, haunted by the image of Silas Kane's cold eyes and the phantom weight of the locket against her skin. Across the yard, the window of Jed's cabin glowed with the warm, inviting light of a lamp. Sometimes she saw his silhouette as he sat at his table, reading or mending a piece of tack. He was older than her, his face etched with lines of sun and loss she could only guess at, but his eyes held stories. She found herself wondering about them, about the man who lived in such profound solitude, but she kept her distance. Trust was a luxury she had lost long ago, along with everything else. Still, his quiet respect began to chip away at the fortress she had built around herself. He never pushed for details about her past, never offered empty pity. He simply gave her work, shared his food, and watched. He was treating her not as a woman or a charity case, but as a hand, an equal in the daily battle for survival. The barn, which had first felt like a refuge, began to feel colder, more isolating with each passing night. She was acutely aware of the space between her and the quiet warmth of the cabin across the yard. This awareness was a new kind of vulnerability, and it frightened her more than any outlaw's gun. She had come here to get stronger, to prepare for a fight. But this silent, steady man was threatening to breach defenses she hadn't even known were there. One evening, a storm rolled in from the west, a bruised and turbulent mass of clouds that swallowed the setting sun. The wind rose to a mournful howl, and the first drops of rain fell like scattered stones against the barn's tin roof. Alara sat inside, huddled in her thin blanket, watching as lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, momentarily illuminating the stark landscape. The thunder that followed was a deep, guttural roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The barn door creaked open, and Jedediah stood there, a lantern in his hand, casting a warm, flickering glow. He was soaked, his hat dripping water onto the dusty floor. "Come inside," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a simple statement of fact. She shook her head, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I'm fine." Stubborn pride was all she had left. His jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in the lantern light. "This ain't a suggestion. A storm like this can tear the roof off this old barn. You'll stay in the cabin." Her heart tripped a nervous flutter against her ribs, but her voice stayed sharp. "I ain't your charity, Mr. Stone." He didn't budge, his gaze unwavering. "My roof, my rules. Now are you coming? Or am I going to have to carry you?" There was no threat in his tone, only a weary sort of patience, as if he'd dealt with her brand of stubbornness 100 times before. Reluctantly, she rose. Her boots squelched in the mud as she followed him across the churning yard. The cabin was simple and spare, built of sturdy, hand-hewn logs. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The air inside was warm and smelled of wood smoke and brewing coffee. It was the smell of home, a scent so foreign it made her throat tighten. Jed tossed a thick wool blanket onto the floor near the hearth. "Floor is yours," he said, gesturing with his chin. "It's warmer than the barn." She hesitated, her pride warring with the bone-deep chill that had settled into her. Finally, the promise of warmth won. She sank onto the blanket, the hearth's glow seeping into her weary bones, easing a tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. Jed sat in a worn armchair across from her, silent, and began carving a small piece of wood with a pocket knife. The storm raged outside, the wind shrieking and rain drumming against the roof. But inside, the world was still and quiet, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the soft scrape of his knife against wood. She awoke to the soft gray light of dawn creeping through the window. The storm had passed. The fire was a bed of glowing embers, and the cabin was still. Jed was already gone. The blanket had been tucked carefully around her shoulders while she slept. She frowned at the gesture, unsettled by its simple kindness. Outside, the air was washed clean, and the rising sun set the damp earth steaming. Jed was by the corral, saddling 2 horses. His movements were sure and fluid. "Ride with me today?" he called over, not looking at her. "Need to check the northern fence line. Storm might have brought it down." She nodded, grabbing a bridle without a word. As they rode out, the plain stretched before them, endless and green from the rain. For the first time since the robbery, she felt something other than fear or anger. Tethered to the solid presence of the man beside her and the powerful animal beneath her, she felt a flicker of something that might have been peace. They reached the high ridge that overlooked the northern pastures. The wind sang through the tall grasses, and she breathed it in, deep, a clean, wild scent that filled her lungs. As Jed dismounted to check a section of fence, he pointed to the sky. A lone red-tailed hawk circled on the updrafts, its wings spread wide against the blue. "A lot like you," he said, his voice quiet. "Wild, always watching. But looking for a place to land." She scoffed a reflexive, defensive sound. "I'm just passing through." He didn't push, just finished his work and swung back into his saddle. But his words stung because they were true. Her chest ached with an emotion she couldn't name. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something dangerously close. As they rode back toward the quiet solidity of the ranch, she realized the greatest threat wasn't Silas Kane's gang rumored to be in the territory. The greatest danger was this quiet man and his silent cabin, which were beginning to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like a place she might, if she wasn't careful, call home. Ilara's trips into Redemption for supplies became intelligence-gathering missions. While Jed negotiated prices for feed and salt licks, she haunted the saloon listening to the loose talk of prospectors and traveling salesmen. She learned to nurse a single sarsaparilla for an hour, making herself part of the dusty scenery, her ears tuned for any mention of Silas Kane. Weeks passed, and the whispers began to form a pattern. Kane's gang had struck again, a payroll wagon near the Black Creek Pass. Then a land office in the next county. Each target seemed random, disparate acts of banditry. But as Ilara painstakingly mapped them out in her mind, a chilling connection emerged. The payroll was for a mining company her father had once invested in. The land office held the deeds to properties he had surveyed as a young man. These weren't random attacks. This was a systematic erasure of her father's legacy. Silas Kane wasn't just a thief. He was a ghost, deliberately haunting the footsteps of Marshal William Vance. Jedediah watched her obsession grow, his expression a mixture of concern and resignation. Their professional relationship, born of necessity, had slowly deepened into a fragile, unspoken trust. He saw the way she practiced with the old rifle he'd given her, her determination hardening her features as she learned to shoot clean and true. He saw the dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights spent poring over old county maps she'd acquired from the town clerk. "This vengeance," he said one evening as they sat by the fire in the cabin, "it's a fire that burns the one who holds it." He was mending a bridle, his powerful hands surprisingly deft, with the needle and leather. "He took my past from me," she countered, her voice low and fierce. "I need to know why." "And what if the answer is something you don't want to hear?" he asked, his gaze steady. Her own story began to emerge in fragments offered up in the quiet intimacy of the cabin. "Ran from a bad deal," she'd said one night, staring into the flames. "Family's gone. Been moving since." It was a painfully abbreviated version of the truth, but it was more than she had told anyone in years. Jed had simply nodded, his lack of judgment a quiet invitation. "This land holds ghosts too," he'd replied. "But it's home." He began to help, leveraging his own quiet influence. He spoke to Sheriff Gable not about Ilara's quest, but about the security of the territory, asking pointed questions about Kane's movements. He spoke to an old friend who ran the telegraph office, asking him to keep an ear out for any news regarding the gang. He was being drawn into her war, not because he believed in her revenge, but because he was starting to believe in her. He saw the woman beneath the armor of anger and grief. And he had decided, in his quiet way, that she would not face this alone. The turning point came on a sweltering afternoon in late summer. Ilara tracked down a man named Elias Croft, a retired deputy who had served under her father. She found him living in a small, dusty, clapboard house on the edge of town, his days spent rocking on his porch and watching the world go by. He squinted at her, his eyes clouded with age as she introduced herself. The name Vance stirred something in his memory. "William Vance's girl," he rasped, his voice thin as autumn leaves. "Lord, I'll be." You've got his eyes. That same fire. She sat with him for over an hour, her questions gentle but persistent. At first, he spoke of her father with reverence, a great lawman, fair and respected. But as she pressed him about the end of his career, about why they had left Redemption so abruptly, when she was just a child, a shadow crossed Croft's face. There was a scandal, he admitted, his gaze drifting to the past. A nasty business. Your father was a good man, Alara, but he made powerful enemies. He told her the story. A prominent local businessman, Thaddeus Kane, had accused Marshall Vance of using his office to systematically ruin him, freezing his assets, and driving his businesses into the ground over a trumped-up embezzlement charge. The town had been divided. Kane was a charismatic popular figure, and Vance was seen by some as an overzealous lawman. Before any formal inquiry could be completed, Thaddeus Kane's businesses collapsed entirely. The man lost everything. A week later, he was found dead, a victim of his own hand, leaving behind a wife and a young son. The scandal had faded, but it had cast a long shadow, forcing Marshall Vance to resign and move his family away in disgrace. A young son, Alara whispered, the pieces clicking into place with a horrifying certainty. What was his name? Croft looked at her, his old eyes filled with a sudden dawning pity. Silas, he said. His boy's name was Silas. The world tilted on its axis. The air in her lungs felt thin and sharp. This wasn't about money or land. This was a blood feud, a legacy of ruin passed down from father to son. Silas Kane wasn't just robbing the memory of her father. He was seeking to settle a score to reclaim his family's honor by destroying the last remnant of the Vance family. The fight was no longer about a stolen locket. It was about her life, her name, and the terrible, complicated truth of who her father had really been. She was not a random victim. She was the final target. The revelation settled over Alara like a shroud, poisoning the fragile peace she had found at the ranch. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered accusation. She looked at Jedediah, at the life he had built from solitude and soil, and saw only what she was putting at risk. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest. Silas Kane, now aware of her location through his network of informants, began to tighten his net. The terror was insidious, a war of attrition designed to break them slowly. It began with the water. One morning, Jed found their main irrigation channel to the creek, blocked the diverted water, flooding a fallow field while their crops began to wither under the relentless sun. It took them 2 days of back-breaking labor to clear the debris and restore the flow. A week later, a section of the northern fence was cut during the night, and a dozen prize cattle were scattered into the canyons. It took the better part of a week to round them up, and 2 were lost to wolves. The attacks were subtle, deniable. There was no direct proof it was Kane's work, but they both knew. He was toying with them, a cat with a cornered mouse, demonstrating his reach and his patience. The psychological toll was even greater. In town, Jed's long-standing credit at the general store was suddenly revoked. Old friends grew distant, their greetings strained. Rumors began to circulate that Jed was harboring a wanted woman, that he was involved in Kane's illicit activities himself. Silas was poisoning the well of public opinion, isolating them, turning Jed's sanctuary into a prison. The strain began to fray the bond between Alara and Jed. The comfortable silences they once shared became heavy with unspoken tension. "This is my fight, Jedediah." "Not yours," Alara said one evening, unable to bear the weariness she saw etched on his face. "I should leave. Draw him away from you." "And go where," he shot back, his voice sharper than she had ever heard it. "He'll hunt you down wherever you run. Leaving now doesn't solve anything. It just gets you killed alone. It's better than getting you killed with me." She cried, the words torn from her. "Look what I've brought to your doorstep. He's destroying everything you've built. This ranch is built of wood and stone." He thundered, rising to his feet, his calm demeanor finally cracking. "It can be rebuilt. I've lost more than this before. but I will not stand by and watch a good woman be hunted down because of the so-called sins of her father." The force of his declaration stunned her into silence. It was the first time he had spoken of his feelings so plainly, the first time he had allowed the fire she'd always sensed in him to burn free. But his words were a double-edged sword. They bound him to her, but they also confirmed her deepest fear his life was now irrevocably tied to her fate. The breaking point came a few days later. Jed's best horse, a magnificent buckskin stallion he had raised from a foal, was found sick in its stall. The town doctor, a man named Miller, who also served as the veterinarian, came out to the ranch. His diagnosis was swift and grim. Poison. A slow-acting toxin mixed into the horse's feed. There was nothing he could do. Elara stood beside Jed as he held the dying animal's head, whispering to it in a low, soothing voice as its life ebbed away. When it was over, Jed rose, his face a mask of cold, quiet fury. He walked to the cabin without a word, returning with his rifle and a box of cartridges. Elara's heart seized. "What are you doing?" Ending this, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You can't," she pleaded, stepping in front of him. "You can't face him alone. This is what he wants. He wants to provoke you, to draw you out." He crossed a line, Elara. Jed said, his eyes like chips of flint. "He came into my home. He harmed my family. This is my fight now, too." She saw the truth in his eyes. Silas had made a grave miscalculation. In trying to isolate Elara by terrorizing the ranch, he had not broken Jed's spirit. He had forged it into a weapon. The rift between them healed in that terrible moment, reforged in the crucible of shared loss and a common deadly purpose. They were no longer a rancher and his hand, but partners in a war they could not escape. The next move would be theirs. The sandstorm hit without warning, a roiling ochre wall that descended from the heavens and swallowed the world whole. The sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow, and the wind screamed like a banshee, tearing at the cabin and rattling the windows in their frames. Visibility dropped to near zero. It was the perfect cover. Elara was securing the shutters when she saw the piece of paper impaled on the corral gate, held fast by a bowie knife, plunge deep into the wood. Her blood ran cold. Jed was out in the west pasture checking on the herd before the storm hit its peak. He was alone. She raced through the blinding dust, her bandana pulled tight over her face, and ripped the note from the blade. The handwriting was elegant, precise, a stark contrast to the violent act that had delivered it. The old mission church at Devil's Ridge. The woman for the man. Come alone. Silas had him. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her, but on its heels came a white-hot surge of rage. This ended tonight. She ran back to the cabin, the wind trying to tear her from her feet. Inside, she strapped on her gun belt and checked the loads in her pistol. She grabbed the rifle Jed had taught her to use, its weight familiar and reassuring in her hands. As she turned to leave, her eyes fell on the small carved wooden horse Jed had made for her sitting on the mantelpiece. A symbol of a life she had just begun to believe was possible. She tucked it into her pocket. The ride to Devil's Ridge was a nightmare journey through a churning, abrasive hell. The wind howled and the sand scoured her skin, stinging her eyes until they were raw. The abandoned mission church emerged from the maelstrom like a skeletal ghost, its bell tower a jagged finger pointing at the furious sky. She dismounted, tethering her horse in the relative shelter of a rock outcropping, and approached the church on foot, rifle held ready. The heavy doors groaned open under her touch. The interior was a vast, cavernous space, filled with swirling dust and the eerie whistling of the wind through broken, stained glass windows. Dim, dust-filtered light illuminated pews in various states of decay, and an altar shrouded in cobwebs. Silas Kane stood before the altar, calm and composed, as if commanding the storm itself. Jed was there, bound to a thick wooden pillar, a fresh bruise darkening his temple, but his eyes clear and defiant. 2 of Kane's men flanked him, their pistols drawn. "Miss Vance." Silas greeted her, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "I'm so glad you could make it. I was beginning to worry about your punctuality." He gestured to Jed. "Your rancher friend has proven to be quite resilient, a commendable if foolish quality." "I'll let him go, Kane." Alara said, her voice steady, betraying none of the terror knotting her stomach. Her rifle was aimed squarely at his chest. Silas chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "All in good time. First, a business proposition. You see, I've done some research. This land, this ranch of yours, it sits on a parcel that was unjustly seized from my father decades ago. I have the original survey maps. All I require is a signature from the current owner on this deed, transferring it back to its rightful heir." He produced a document from his duster. "Sign it over, and I will let your friend live. I'll even return something of yours." He reached into his pocket and produced the silver locket. It glinted in the dim light, a beacon in the gloom. He tossed it onto the dusty floor between them. The deed for the man? A fair trade, wouldn't you say? It was a perfect trap. Her life for Jed's, her past for his future. But Alara had come for a different kind of transaction. My father was an honest lawman. She said, her voice ringing with a conviction she hadn't felt until this very moment. He didn't ruin your family. A comforting lie, I'm sure, Silas sneered. But the facts speak for themselves. No, Alara said, taking a slow step forward, her gaze locked with his. Let's talk about the facts. She knelt, never taking her eyes off him, and picked up the locket. Her fingers, slick with sweat, fumbled with the clasp. It sprang open. You took this because it was my mother and father. Because it was the last piece of the family you wanted to destroy. She held it up. Look at them, Silas. Look at the people you've dedicated your life to hating. He glanced at it, his lip curling in contempt. But Alara wasn't finished. With her thumbnail, she pried at the edge of her father's tiny portrait. The tin image lifted, revealing a tiny, folded piece of yellowed paper, tucked behind it, a secret she had never known it held. She carefully unfolded it. My father didn't keep trophies of his victories, Silas. He kept evidence. She held the paper out. This is a signed confession. Not from my father. From your father's business partner, a man named Alistair Finch, admitting that he was the one who embezzled the company's funds, and that he fed my father false evidence to frame Thaddeus Kane and cover his own tracks. The world seemed to stop. The howling of the storm faded to a distant murmur. Silas stared at the paper, his face draining of all color. His entire life, his quest for vengeance, the righteous fury that had fueled him for 2 decades, it was all built on a lie. His father wasn't a martyr. He was a victim just like hers. That single moment of stunned realization was all Alara needed. She dropped the locket and confession and dove behind a fallen pew as Silas, his face contorted in a mask of disbelief and rage, screamed, "Lies!" A gunshot exploded, splintering the wood where she had been standing. Alara brought her rifle up, remembering Jed's lessons. Use your environment. Don't fight their fight. Make them fight yours. She fired not at Kane, but at the rusted chain, holding the heavy mission bell high in the tower above them. The bullet struck the link with a sharp crack. The massive bronze bell, freed from its ancient mooring, plummeted downward, crashing through the rotted timbers of the choir loft and landing on the floor. with a cataclysmic boom that shook the very foundations of the church, kicking up a blinding cloud of dust and debris. In the ensuing chaos, Jed surged against his ropes, throwing his weight into one of the guards and sending him sprawling. Ilara fired again, her shot hitting the other guard in the shoulder. As Silas raised his pistol through the dust, aiming blindly, a final deafening gunshot echoed from the church entrance. Silas crumpled to the ground, clutching a wound in his leg. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the raging storm, was Sheriff Gable, his smoking pistol held steady. The storm, as if on cue, began to break, its fury abating as the first rays of clean, post-tempest light pierced through the gloom. In the storm's quiet aftermath, the air in the old church was thick with the scent of ozone dust and spent gunpowder. Sheriff Gable and his deputy took a broken Silas Kane into custody. He didn't resist. The revelation contained in that tiny folded piece of paper had shattered him more completely than any bullet ever could. He was a man whose life's purpose had been revealed as a tragic, hollow lie. Ilara rushed to Jed's side, her knife quickly severing the ropes that bound him. He slumped against the pillar, his face pale but his eyes clear. He had a nasty cut on his forehead, but he was alive. She gently touched his bruised cheek, her fingers trembling with relief. "You came," he murmured, his voice rough. "You thought I wouldn't," she whispered back, a tear she hadn't realized she was holding finally tracing a clean path through the grime on her face. Their bond, forged in the quiet rhythm of ranch work and tempered in the fire of Silas Kane's vengeance, solidified in that silent moment. There were no more walls between them, no more guarded secrets. They had faced the ghosts of the past together and survived. As they emerged from the church, the sandstorm had passed completely, leaving the world washed clean and glistening under a sliver of emerging sun. Sheriff Gable tipped his hat to Ilara. "That confession will be sent to the territorial judge," he said, his voice holding a new note of deep respect. "It won't bring your father back, Miss Vance, but it will clear his name. For good." The town of Redemption, which had once whispered about her with suspicion, learned the full truth of the old scandal. The story of her courage at the church and of Jedediah Stone's unwavering loyalty spread through the territory. Ilara Vance was no longer seen as a victim or a drifter, but as a woman of immense strength and integrity. The journey back to the ranch was slow and quiet. Ilara rode beside Jed, tending to his wounds when they stopped to rest. He leaned on her both literally and figuratively, and she found she had the strength to support them both. When they finally crested the familiar ridge and saw the cabin nestled in the valley below, a profound sense of peace settled over her. It wasn't just a refuge anymore. It was home. That night, she tended to his injuries with gentle, practiced hands. The cabin was filled not with tension, but with a quiet, shared understanding. The ordeal was over. They had survived. Their future, uncertain just hours before now, stretched before them as open and promising as the vast, clear sky outside. Months later, spring breathed new life into the land. The grasses on the plains were a vibrant green, and wildflowers dotted the landscape in bursts of brilliant color. The Stone Ranch was thriving, a testament to the hard work and shared resilience of the two people who called it home. The scars of Kane's attacks had faded, the fences mended, the herds replenished. Ilara was no longer a hand for hire, but a partner in every sense of the word. Her voice, once clipped and guarded, now carried across the yard with easy authority, and her laughter, once a rarity, was a common sound in the warm wooden cabin. One clear, bright morning they rode out together, not to check fences or round up cattle, but on a more personal journey. They traveled to the small, windswept cemetery on the outskirts of Redemption, a quiet place where weathered wooden markers stood as lonely sentinels. They stopped before two graves, those of Marshal William Vance and his wife Eleanor. Elara dismounted and knelt her hand, tracing the faded letters of her father's name. For years his memory had been a complicated burden, the hero of her childhood tainted by the scandal that had shadowed their lives. Now, with his name officially cleared and the truth revealed, she could finally see him for what he was: a good man who had been caught in a web of deceit, a man who had loved his daughter enough to hide a terrible truth within a silver locket to protect her. She pulled the locket from her pocket. It was empty now. She had removed the tiny portraits of her parents and the folded confession, keeping them safe in a small wooden box back at the cabin. The silver shell itself, the symbol of her grief, her quest, and the painful weight of her past, she no longer needed. With a quiet prayer of forgiveness for her father's secrets, for the shadows they had cast, and for the anger she had carried for so long, she placed the locket on the earth of his grave. It was an act of letting go, of closing a chapter that had defined her for too long. Jedediah stood beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, a silent, steady presence. He had given her a home, a purpose, and the space to heal. He had trusted her, fought for her, and in doing so had shown her how to trust again. As she rose, she took his outstretched hand. They stood together for a moment, looking out at the endless horizon, their future unwritten. Then they mounted their horses and turned back toward the ranch, and their hands clasped together. Elara Vance was no longer a fugitive from her past, but a woman riding confidently toward her future, her home, and the life she was building day by day under the vast western sky.